The story begins in a dimly lit interrogation room in Texas, 1983. A man sits across from investigators, his gaze heavy, his words deliberate. He claims to have taken countless lives, sometimes speaking of dozens, other times of hundreds. The numbers are so vast they seem to stretch beyond reason, yet the room hangs on every syllable. Henry Lee Lucas was not born into peace. His childhood in Virginia was marked by poverty, cruelty, and abandonment. Imagine a boy growing up in a house where the walls echoed with shouting, where survival meant enduring humiliation and pain. He lost sight in one eye after a childhood injury, and from then on the world looked fractured, half-hidden. That broken lens became a metaphor for the life he would lead, distorted, incomplete, and shadowed. Years later, after drifting across states, Lucas's words would shake America. He spoke of incidents scattered across the country, painting himself as a figure who seemed to appear everywhere at once. Police departments desperate to close unsolved files leaned in, eager for answers. His confessions became headlines, and for a time, he was seen as the most prolific figure in American criminal history. But then came the contradictions. Journalists uncovered records showing Lucas in prison or hospitalized at the very times he claimed to be elsewhere. Investigators realized he had been fed maps, photographs, and details before his statement. It was as if he had become the mouthpiece of information already in police hands. And here lies the twist. Lucas was often rewarded for his cooperation, better meals, trips outside prison, privileges that gave him a taste of freedom. Each new confession kept him relevant, kept him moving, kept him fed. One surprising fact is that at one point, he claimed to have committed 3 incidents in a single night, spread across different states, a feat that was physically impossible. Yet those words were enough to close cases, leaving families with answers that may never have been true. The legacy of Henry Lee Lucas is not just about violence. It is about the fragility of truth when fear and urgency drive investigations. Was he a manipulative drifter who craved attention or a pawn in a system desperate for closure? The line between fact and fabrication blurred until it became almost impossible to see where reality ended and invention began. As the camera fades to black, the narrator's voice lingers. In the end, Lucas left behind more questions than answers. His story reminds us that not every confession is truth. Sometimes it is only a convenient narrative. And in those shadows, the real victims may remain unheard. If stories like this captivate you, where truth and deception collide, stay with us. There are more investigations ahead, each revealing the darker corners of human nature. Picture a small wooden house in rural Virginia, 1936. The paint is peeling. The windows are cracked. Inside, the air is thick with something darker than poverty, something that twists the soul before it even has a chance to form. This is where Henry Lee Lucas begins, not as a name in headlines, not as a figure in interrogation rooms, but as a boy, silent, watchful, already learning that home is not safety. Home is endurance. His father sits slumped in the corner, drowning in whiskey. His mother moves through the rooms like a storm, unpredictable and violent. The boy learns early that weakness invites punishment, that crying brings only mockery, that asking for kindness is a foolish prayer in a house built on cruelty. And then comes the day that changes everything. A childhood accident. Details remain murky, but the result is clear. Young Henry loses vision in one eye. From that moment forward, the world becomes fractured, half seen, half hidden. It's as if reality itself splits in two. One eye sees what is, the other sees only darkness. He stops going to school, not because he chooses to, but because no one cares whether he shows up. He drifts through his early years like a shadow, isolated, withdrawn, building walls around himself that no one ever tries to break down. Here's something most people don't know. As a child, Lucas was often forced to watch his mother engage in relations with strangers for money, sometimes made to wait outside in freezing temperatures for hours. The humiliation wasn't just physical, it was psychological, a slow erosion of any sense of dignity or self-worth. The violence he witnessed didn't stay outside him. It seeped inward, filling the empty spaces where love and stability should have been. Small thefts began. Running away became routine. Brushes with the law turned into patterns. The boy who grew up learning that survival meant silence was now learning that survival meant taking what the world refused to give. But this, all of this, was only the beginning. The scars were forming. The anger was building. And somewhere deep in that fractured vision, in that half-lit childhood, something was being shaped that would one day shock an entire nation. Not because of what he did, but because of what he would say he did. And the terrifying truth is, we may never know the difference. 1960, a year that would split Henry Lee Lucas's life into before and after. The winter air in Michigan is cold enough to burn your lungs. Inside a cramped apartment, voices rise. A mother and son locked in the same toxic dance they've performed for decades. But this time, the music stops. The argument escalates. Words become weapons. Then something breaks, not just in the room, but in him. In a moment of rage that lasts only seconds, but echoes for a lifetime, Henry Lee Lucas crosses a line that can never be uncrossed. His mother falls. The woman who shaped him through cruelty becomes his first victim. He runs, not far, not well. Within days, authorities find him. The trial is swift. The verdict, guilty. The sentence, decades behind bars. But here's what haunts the story more than the incident itself. Prison doesn't fix what's broken. It only amplifies it. For nearly 10 years, Lucas sits in a cell. The walls close in. The isolation that began in childhood now becomes total. While other inmates find ways to adapt, to dream of redemption, Lucas seems to sink deeper into himself. Therapy sessions go nowhere. Behavioral reports show a man who has learned nothing except how to survive in a cage. When he walks out in the early 1970s, he carries no tools for rebuilding a life, no connections, no skills, no hope of normalcy. What he carries instead is a void, vast, hungry, and growing. He begins to drift, state to state, town to town, a ghost moving through America with no destination, no purpose, no ties. He sleeps in cheap motels, abandoned buildings, sometimes under bridges. He eats when he can. He moves when suspicion follows. And then, somewhere along a desolate highway, fate introduces him to someone equally lost, Ottis Toole. The meeting happens in a soup kitchen in Jacksonville, Florida. Two drifters sharing a table, swapping stories of broken homes and broken lives. What starts as casual conversation becomes something darker. They recognize something in each other, a shared emptiness, a mutual understanding of violence, a comfort in chaos. Here's the detail that most documentaries miss. Toole wasn't just a companion. He came with his own family, including a young niece who would later become central to one of the most heartbreaking unsolved cases in American history. The web of connections between these two men would eventually touch dozens of investigations across multiple states. They begin traveling together, two shadows moving in tandem, feeding off each other's instability. Where one man alone might hesitate, two embolden each other. The partnership becomes a catalyst, accelerating something that was already in motion. But here's the question that would haunt investigators for decades. What exactly were they doing during those years on the road? Were they truly responsible for the trail of incidents they would later describe? Or were they simply two broken men, wandering aimlessly, constructing fantasies to give meaning to meaningless lives? The truth would prove more complicated than anyone imagined. Because in 1983, everything changes again. Lucas is arrested in Texas. And when the interrogation begins, he doesn't just talk about one case. He talks about hundreds. And America listens in horror, unable to look away, unable to know what's real and what's performance. The nightmare is just beginning. But whose nightmare is it really? Texas, 1983. A small interrogation room with fluorescent lights humming overhead. The air conditioning rattles. A tape recorder sits on the table, its red light glowing. Henry Lee Lucas sits across from investigators arrested for two local incidents involving women found near the Texas-Mexico border. It seems straightforward, another violent crime in a state that's seen too many. Detectives expect a confession, maybe some resistance, then paperwork. What they get instead changes everything. Lucas starts talking. At first, he describes the two cases they already know about. Details match. Locations check out. The investigators nod, scribbling notes. But then something strange happens. He doesn't stop. He begins mentioning another incident, then another, then three more. The detectives exchange glances. One leans forward. "How many are we talking about here?" Lucas's answer is almost casual, more than you'd believe. Within days, the number climbs to dozens. Then it passes 50, then 100. The interrogation room becomes a theater of horror as Lucas describes incidents spanning multiple states, different years, victims of all descriptions. He recalls highways, motels, rest stops, abandoned buildings. He mentions names, he sketches maps. And the investigators, exhausted, overwhelmed, but also strangely energized, keep listening. Here's what made this moment so explosive. America in the early 1980s was drowning in unsolved cases. Small-town police departments had filing cabinets stuffed with cold investigations. Families were desperate for answers. The pressure to solve crimes was immense, the resources limited. And suddenly, sitting before them, was a man offering solutions. Word spreads fast. Detectives from other states hear about Lucas and his confessions. They arrive in Texas with photographs, case files, questions. One by one, they enter that interrogation room hoping he'll say the magic words that close their cases. And often he does. He describes a woman found near a river in Louisiana. Correct. A couple discovered in Oklahoma. He knows the location. An incident in Florida that matches Ottis Toole's movements. Everything seems to fit. The media catches wind. Headlines explode across the nation. Drifter confesses to hundreds of crimes. Most prolific case in American history. The man who killed across America. Lucas becomes infamous overnight. His face appears on magazine covers. Documentary crews request interviews. He's transported between states like a grotesque celebrity, giving tours of crime scenes, pointing out where bodies were found, explaining methods with chilling detail. For law enforcement, it feels like a miracle. Departments close cases that have haunted them for years. Families receive phone calls they'd stopped hoping for. Communities breathe easier knowing someone has been caught. But here's the lesser-known fact that would later unravel everything. During this confession spree, Lucas was given unprecedented privileges. Better food, trips outside prison, comfortable hotel rooms during his crime scene tours. He even received milkshakes, strawberry his favorite, and was allowed to smoke cigarettes freely, luxuries that made him the envy of every inmate in Texas. For a man who'd spent his entire life invisible and powerless, suddenly he mattered. Every new confession brought attention, special treatment, importance. He wasn't just confessing, he was performing. And then, quietly at first, someone notices something impossible. A journalist cross-checks dates. A defense attorney reviews prison records. An investigator from Michigan pulls travel logs. The timeline doesn't work. Lucas confesses to an incident in California on June 15, 1978. But records show he was locked up in Maryland that entire week. He describes a case in Georgia on a specific date, but his employment records prove he was working construction in Florida. He claims to have committed 3 separate incidents in 3 different states within 24 hours, a physical impossibility even by car. The cracks begin to show. And the question that should have been asked from the beginning finally surfaces. If Henry Lee Lucas was in custody, hospitalized, or verifiably elsewhere during these incidents, then who actually committed them? The investigation that was supposed to bring closure suddenly becomes something far more disturbing. Not a solved case, but a national scandal. Not answers, but a labyrinth of lies, desperation, and institutional failure. The confession that terrified America was about to become the confession that shamed it. And the truth, whatever it was, remained buried somewhere between what Lucas said and what actually happened. The nightmare wasn't ending. It was just changing shape. Picture a newsroom in Dallas, 1984. Coffee-stained desks, typewriters clacking, phones ringing. A young investigative journalist named Hugh Ainsworth sits surrounded by paper, stacks of police reports, confession transcripts, prison records, hospital logs. He's building a timeline, and it's falling apart. Lucas claims he was in New Mexico on October 3, 1979, involved in an incident near Albuquerque. Ainsworth checks the date, then checks again. According to official records, Lucas was behind bars in Maryland that entire month, not close to New Mexico, not even in the same time zone. The journalist circles the discrepancy in red ink, then finds another, and another. The pattern is impossible to ignore. As Lucas's confessions continue to pile up, now exceeding 300 separate incidents, others begin asking the same questions. Defense attorneys request documentation. Legal advocates start making phone calls. Independent investigators pull archival records. And slowly, methodically, the house of cards begins to tremble. A confession in Virginia for March 1977. Lucas was hospitalized in Texas with pneumonia. A case in Illinois for June 1978. Employment records show him working a night shift job in Florida, verified by time cards and witness statements. An incident in Colorado during a 3-day span. He was documented in a Georgia jail on drunk and disorderly charges. The math simply doesn't work. But here's where the story takes its most disturbing turn. Investigators start reviewing the interrogation process itself. They obtain audio recordings, written transcripts, procedural logs, and what they discover is chilling, not because of what Lucas said, but because of what he was shown before he said it. In interview after interview, detectives brought materials into the room. Crime scene photographs, maps with locations circled, detailed reports describing victims, methods, and timelines. Then they asked Lucas to remember what happened. He would study the materials, pause, then provide a confession that matched almost exactly what was already on the page in front of him. One particularly revealing case involved an incident in Tennessee. Lucas claimed to remember specific details: the victim's clothing, the location of the scene, even the weather that day. Impressive, until investigators realized he'd been handed the police report 30 minutes earlier. He wasn't remembering, he was reading. Here's the lesser-known fact that exposes just how deep this problem went. In at least one documented case, Lucas confessed to an incident while holding the actual case file in his hands, essentially narrating the report back to investigators as if it were his own memory. The detective conducting the interview later admitted he'd given Lucas helpful materials to jog his memory. The implications are staggering. How many departments, desperate to close cold cases, had inadvertently fed him the very information they thought he was providing? How many confessions were genuine recollections versus skillful regurgitation of facts already in police hands? Document after document surfaces. In some jurisdictions, Lucas was shown photographs of victims before identifying them. In others, he was driven to crime scenes and then asked to show where it happened, as if retracing steps rather than revealing new information. The collaboration between Lucas and law enforcement had become a feedback loop. He told them what they wanted to hear. They rewarded him with privileges, attention, and field trips. Everyone got what they needed, except the truth. Meanwhile, cases kept getting closed. Press conferences were held. Families were told their loved ones' investigations were solved. Chief of police departments took credit for cracking the unsolvable, but the foundation was crumbling. The question becomes unavoidable, haunting. How far can the need to solve crimes distort the search for truth? When departments are drowning in unsolved cases, when political pressure demands results, when families are begging for closure, how easy does it become to accept a convenient answer instead of the right one? If this investigation is gripping you, if you're starting to see how truth and convenience can become dangerously entangled, let us know in the comments. Do you believe Lucas, was a master manipulator exploiting the system, or was he a broken man being used by institutions desperate for answers? Because what happens next will challenge everything you think you understand about confessions, credibility, and justice. The investigators who once celebrated Lucas's cooperation are about to face a reckoning. The families who thought they'd found peace are about to have that peace shattered. And Lucas himself, the man at the center of this storm, is about to reveal just how performative his entire confession spree really was. The truth was never about how many incidents he committed. It was about how many people were willing to believe him without asking the hard questions. And the answer to that is the most frightening part of all. Imagine a man who has spent most of his adult life in a 6-by-8-foot cell, eating the same gray food, staring at the same concrete walls, invisible to the world. Now imagine that same man sitting in the back of a police cruiser, watching the Texas landscape roll by. The windows are down. Wind rushes through his hair. He's being taken to a restaurant, a real restaurant, where he orders a steak, medium rare, with all the sides. A detective sits across from him, friendly, almost collegial. "Tell us about the case in Williamson County," the detective says, sliding a photograph across the table. Lucas studies it while chewing his steak. Then he nods. "Yeah, I remember that one." Another case closed, another meal earned. This is how the machine works. By 1984, a pattern has emerged that makes the entire investigation look less like law enforcement and more like a transaction. Lucas provides confessions. In return, he receives privileges that transform his existence from prisoner to something closer to consultant. The perks are documented, transferred to comfortable county jails instead of maximum security, allowed cigarettes and sweets whenever he wants, given access to television, magazines, and phone calls. But the real prize is the travel. Lucas is flown across state lines, driven to different jurisdictions, housed in motels instead of cells. He visits crime scenes like a tour guide, pointing out locations, describing events while investigators take notes. For a man who once drifted homeless and powerless, this is intoxicating. Here's the startling detail most people never hear. Lucas was once taken to a Ramada Inn in Louisiana, given his own room with a color television and room service, and allowed to order whatever he wanted while helping local authorities with an unsolved case. The bill, paid by the sheriff's department, included multiple steak dinners, pay-per-view movies, and even minibar charges. He wasn't being interrogated. He was being entertained. The incentive structure becomes crystal clear. Every new confession extends his relevance. Every solved case keeps him valuable. The moment he stops talking, the perks disappear, and he goes back to being just another inmate in an overcrowded prison. So he keeps talking. And law enforcement keeps listening, because they have incentives too. Picture police departments across America in the early 80s. Budget cuts, staff shortages, filing cabinets stuffed with cold cases that haunt communities and damage careers. Families calling weekly, asking for updates that don't exist. Politicians demanding results. Then along comes Lucas, offering solutions. For a chief of police under pressure, closing even one high-profile case can mean job security, funding approval, positive press coverage. When Lucas confesses to 5 cases in your jurisdiction, you become a hero. You hold a press conference. You tell grieving families they finally have answers. No one wants to look too closely at how those answers were obtained. A symbiotic relationship forms, dark, self-sustaining, and increasingly detached from truth. Police need closures. Lucas needs comfort and significance. The system feeds itself. Documents later reveal the scale of this exchange. In one 18-month period, Lucas was transported to 37 different locations across 17 states. He stayed in hotels 96 nights. He was never handcuffed during these trips. He ate at restaurants over 100 times. He was treated less like a suspect and more like a cooperating witness in a case against himself. But here's where the machine's true cost becomes visible. If Lucas confessed to hundreds of incidents he didn't commit, that means hundreds of real investigations were closed prematurely. Real perpetrators remained free. Real evidence was never pursued. Real victims' families received false closure. The machine didn't solve crimes. It buried them under a mountain of convenient lies. And perhaps the most disturbing realization, everyone involved had reasons to keep it running. Detectives got solved cases. Politicians got positive headlines. Lucas got steaks and road trips. The only people not served by this arrangement were the ones who mattered most, the victims and their families, who deserved truth instead of theater. One investigator would later describe the phenomenon in chilling terms. "We built an assembly line for confessions, and nobody stopped to check if we were manufacturing justice or just manufacturing paperwork." The question that emerges is almost too frightening to ask. If so many confessions were false, How many actual crimes remain unsolved to this day? How many families believe they have answers when they really just have performances? How many real perpetrators walked free because police departments were satisfied with Lucas's words instead of demanding evidence? The machine had created an illusion of justice so convincing that even the people operating it failed to see the truth. And the most tragic irony? Lucas himself tried to tell them. In a moment of unexpected candor during a 1985 interview, he leaned back in his chair, lit a cigarette provided by his handlers, and said something that should have stopped everything. "I'll tell you about any case you want. Just show me the file first." He was admitting the game, confessing to the confessions, but the machine was already too far down the road to stop. What happens next will force a reckoning, not just with Lucas, but with an entire system that chose convenience over truth, closure over accuracy, and political expediency over justice. The gears are still turning, but the mechanism is about to break. The courtroom in Huntsville, Texas, 1998. Fluorescent lights hum overhead. The gallery is packed with journalists, legal observers, and family members of victims. Some hoping for justice, others no longer sure what justice even means in a case this tangled. Henry Lee Lucas sits at the defendant's table, older now, grayer, his remaining eye dull and unfocused. He's been convicted and sentenced to death for a single case, the incident involving a woman known as Orange Socks, named for the only identifying clothing found with her remains. It should feel like closure, but nothing about this case has ever been simple. The evidence is thin. No physical forensics tie Lucas to the scene. No witnesses place him there. The conviction rests almost entirely on his own confession, the same type of confession that has now been discredited in dozens of other cases. Defense attorneys file appeal after appeal. They present time cards showing Lucas was working in Florida when the incident occurred in Texas. They submit motel receipts, employment records, witness statements. The timeline doesn't just have gaps. It contradicts the entire prosecution. For years, the case winds through the appeals process, each hearing revealing more cracks in the foundation. Then, in a move that shocks legal observers across the nation, Texas Governor George W. Bush, a politician known for rarely granting clemency, commutes Lucas's death sentence to life in prison. It's the only time in Bush's entire tenure as governor that he intervenes to spare someone from execution. The reason? Too much doubt, too many inconsistencies, too much evidence that the confession may have been just another performance in a years-long theater of lies. By this point, Lucas's public image has undergone a complete transformation. The man once branded as America's most prolific criminal has become something else entirely, a cautionary tale, a symbol of what happens when institutions prioritize convenient answers over difficult truths. Legal scholars begin citing his case in textbooks. Criminal justice reform advocates use him as Exhibit A in arguments against coerced confessions and contaminated interrogations. His name becomes shorthand for systemic failure. But here's the question that haunts everyone. How many incidents did he actually commit? Experts continue to debate. The consensus is clear on at least 3 cases. His mother in 1960, verifiable through trial records and witness testimony. The 2 women in Texas that led to his initial arrest in 1983, supported by physical evidence. Beyond that, shadow and speculation. Some investigators believe the real number is around 11. Others argue it could be as few as 3. A handful still insist he was responsible for dozens. The truth remains buried under layers of false confessions, contaminated evidence, and institutional embarrassment. Here's the lesser-known detail that reveals just how deep the confusion runs. In the years before his death, Lucas himself gave wildly different accounts of his own culpability. In one interview, he claimed he only committed 3 incidents, total. In another, he said 11. In yet another, he insisted he'd been telling the truth all along and had committed more than 100. Even he seemed unsure where the performance ended and reality began. The man who once claimed to be everywhere had become nowhere, a ghost lost in his own mythology. The prison years pass slowly. Lucas fades from headlines. The media circus moves on to other stories. He grows old in a cell, largely forgotten by the public that once couldn't look away. Then, on March 12, 2001, Henry Lee Lucas dies in his sleep from heart failure. He's 64 years old. With him go the answers, the real count, the actual truth. Investigators who spent years trying to separate fact from fiction are left with incomplete puzzles. Families who were told their cases were solved must now confront the possibility that they never were. Communities that thought they'd found their monster realize they may have only found a broken man who learned to play a role. The legacy he leaves behind is not one of violence. It's one of uncertainty. His case exposes the fragility of confessions as evidence. It reveals how easily desperation can corrupt investigations. It demonstrates how institutions, when faced with impossible pressure, sometimes choose the illusion of success over the humility of admitting they don't have answers. And perhaps most disturbingly, it forces us to ask, how many other cases, closed with fanfare and relief, rest on foundations just as shaky? In the end, Henry Lee Lucas didn't just confess to incidents. He confessed a system's willingness to believe whatever it needed to believe. The files remain open in the minds of investigators. The questions linger. And somewhere in the gap between what Lucas said and what actually happened, the real truth stays hidden. A reminder that justice delayed by lies is often justice denied forever. His story doesn't end with clarity. It ends with a warning. Not every confession reveals truth. Sometimes it just reveals how badly we want to believe we've found it. If this investigation has made you question how truth is determined in our justice system, share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Lucas was a manipulator who exploited desperate institutions, or a victim of a system that needed him to be guilty? The answer matters, because the next case built on shaky confessions could be unfolding right now, somewhere, with no one asking the hard questions. The machine may have stopped with Lucas, but the blueprint still exists. And that might be the most terrifying legacy of all. The camera slowly pulls back from a stack of manila folders, each one stamped closed in faded red ink. Dust particles float through a shaft of afternoon sunlight streaming into an evidence room somewhere in Texas. The folders sit silent, settled, seemingly at peace. But are they really? In the end, the case of Henry Lee Lucas remains terrifying, not because of what he did, but because of what he revealed about all of us. This story was never really about one man's capacity for violence. It became something far more unsettling, a mirror held up to an entire system, reflecting back our collective desperation for answers, our willingness to accept convenient narratives, and the dangerous alchemy that occurs when fear and urgency replace patience and truth. We know there were real victims, real lives cut short, real families shattered by loss. That part is not in question. But we also know that somewhere between 300 and 600 confessions, the line separating fact from fiction blurred beyond recognition. Lucas drew that line himself, then danced across it so many times that even he couldn't find his way back to reality. The truly shocking revelation isn't that one man lied. It's that so many were willing to believe him without demanding proof. Think about what this means. While America celebrated the capture of a monster, while departments held press conferences announcing solved cases, while politicians took credit for bringing justice to grieving communities, the real perpetrators of countless incidents may have remained free, walking among us, unidentified, unpursued, because the case was already closed. Here's the detail that crystallizes the tragedy. Decades after Lucas's confessions were debunked, several families discovered that the actual investigations into their loved ones' cases had been completely abandoned once Lucas confessed. Evidence was never tested. Leads were never followed. Files were boxed up and stored away. When those families tried to reopen the cases, they found that crucial evidence had been lost, witnesses had died or moved away, and the trail had gone permanently cold. Lucas's lies didn't just obscure the truth. They erased the possibility of ever finding it. The wounds opened by Lucas's confession machine cut deeper than the original crime. Families who thought they had closure were forced to confront the possibility that they'd been lied to. Communities that believed they were safe realized their security was built on fabrication. And the justice system itself had to reckon with the uncomfortable truth that it had prioritized appearance over substance, convenience over accuracy. One man became the center of a labyrinth so complex that decades later, we're still trying to find the exit. The question lingers in the air like smoke. Was Henry Lee Lucas truly responsible for carnage on an unimaginable scale? Or was he simply the protagonist of one of the greatest controversies in American criminal history? The answer is probably both, and neither, and something in between that we may never fully understand. Because the real horror of this case isn't what Lucas did in the shadows of rural highways. It's what happened in the bright fluorescent light of interrogation rooms, courtrooms, and government offices. It's the realization that truth is fragile, that institutional pressure can warp reality, that the need for closure can become so overwhelming that we accept illusions rather than admit we don't have answers. If there's a lasting lesson from this labyrinth, it's this. Not every confession reveals truth. Sometimes it only reveals our desperation to believe we've found it. The folders marked "closed" may never be reopened. The families may never know what really happened. And somewhere in the gap between Lucas's words and the actual events, the truth remains trapped, a ghost in the machine, forever out of reach. But perhaps acknowledging that uncertainty is more honest than pretending we have certainty where none exists. If this investigation has made you question the nature of truth, justice, and the stories we tell ourselves about both, we want to hear from you. Subscribe to stay with us as we continue exploring cases where the line between fact and fiction becomes dangerously blurred. Share this with someone who needs to understand that not everything presented as solved actually is. And let us know in the comments. Do you believe Henry Lee Lucas was a master manipulator who exploited a broken system, or a broken man exploited by a system desperate for easy answers? Because the answer to that question matters far beyond one case. It shapes how we think about confession evidence, how we demand accountability from institutions, and how we honor the memories of real victims by refusing to settle for comfortable lies. The camera fades to black, but the question remains illuminated in white text. How many other cases are built on foundations just as shaky? And who's asking? The screen goes dark. The silence holds, and in that silence, the real investigation begins. Not into what Henry Lee Lucas did, but into what we allowed to happen in our search for someone to blame. That's the legacy. That's the warning. And that's why, decades later, his name still echoes, not as the answer to hundreds of cases, but as the question we should have been asking all along. Are we seeking truth or just seeking closure? Sometimes they're not the same thing, and recognizing the difference might be the only justice we can still offer.